guys. Today is Tuesday night and we've had a busy afternoon. If you've gotten to go by the drive-through parade, I really enjoyed getting to see your smiling faces, and I know the weather wasn't great for everybody to get to join us, but just know that I'm thinking about you. We also got to have our Zoom meeting, so I'm just soaking up every little bit of time that we can try to be together, and I can see your smiling faces. We're going to get back into our read it loud. Wayside School is Falling Down. This is kind of a funny next 3 chapters because you're going to learn a little bit about Wayside School. They've always said that there's no 19th story. Well, when you get to chapter 19, they say that there is no 19th chapter. That's what the big circle and the line going through it means. There's no 19th chapter. So we're going to read we're going to start with chapter 19, but the next 3 chapters we're going to read are 19. So kind of funny how this book does. 19, A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with 1,000 kids screaming and scurrying to their rooms, but it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th story. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Mrs. Jarvis taught the class on the 19th story, and there was no Mrs. Jarvis. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th? Suddenly, she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stomped on her foot, and then Ron's elbow jammed her in the stomach. Ugh! She grunted, and she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Ron and Dee Dee didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her jacket was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They raced up the stairs, and then they got to Mrs. Jewell's room, and they were too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class were silly, even Rhondy, and Rhondy was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her, and that was because Jason hated her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't really sure which. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their hands flat on their desks with their tongues hanging out. You could have said you were sorry, Allison said as she walked past them. She sat straight up in her chair, folded her arms on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. Look what I brought, he said. What's the name of your goldfish? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Shark, said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. It makes him feel important, said Jason. Where should I put him? How about on top of the coat closet, suggested Mrs. Jewell. Jason had to stand on a chair with his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very top as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. Ah! Yelled Jason as he fell to the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jewell hurried to the back of the room. Quick! Somebody fill the bowl with water, she said. Where's Shark? Jason made a face. I swallowed him. The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jewell rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. You have a bad case of the sillies this morning, she said. She took roll. Who's absent? She asked. Allison, said Rhondy. Very funny, Rhondy, said Allison. Anybody besides Allison? Asked Mrs. Jewell. I'm here, Mrs. Jewell, said Allison, and she sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jewell couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. Just Allison, said Mrs. Jewell, and she marked it on her green roll card. Damien, will you please take the roll card to the office? Allison stood up. I'm not absent, she said. Damien took the roll card and walked out the door. Mrs. Jewell, why did you mark me absent? Asked Allison. Mrs. Jewell didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. Mrs. Jewell, did you really mark me absent? She asked again. Mrs. Jewell looked up. Terrence, what are you whispering about? Nothing, muttered Terrence. If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me, said Mrs. Jewell. Get off my case, buzzard face, said Terrence. "Terrence," exclaimed Mrs. Jules, "go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "But that's what I said to Jenny," Terrence said. "Mrs. Jules, what about me?" Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could, "Mrs. Jules, can you hear me? Can anybody see me?" Nobody answered her. "Rondi," shouted Allison. "Dana, Jason." "This isn't funny," said Allison. "I know you're just pretending." And she stood right in front of Jason and leaned over his desk and stared him right into his eyes. "I know you can see me," she said. "You're just trying not to laugh." And he stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. "Yuck!" she exclaimed, and she wiped off her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. "Have you gone crazy?" shouted Allison, and she ran out of the room down to the class on the 29th story. "Come quick," she said. "There's something wrong here with Mrs. Jules." No one heard her. She slammed the door. She continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The whole school is playing a joke on me, she wondered. "It's not funny," she shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that popped into her head, hoping somebody somewhere would notice her. "Fish for sale! Fresh fish! Fat fish! Get your fresh fat fish!" A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the classrooms. "Shh," she whispered. "This is a school, not a fish market." "You can hear me?" asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. "Yes, I can hear you," the woman said sternly. "My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible to get any work done." "I'm sorry," said Allison, "but something's wrong in Mrs. Jules' class." "You better come in here," said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. "What's your name?" the teacher asked her. "Allison." "Boys and girls, this is Allison," the teacher announced to the students. "She'll be joining our class." "What?" said Allison. "But my name is Mrs. Jarvis," said the teacher. Welcome to the 19th story. So, we're still on chapter 19. A wonderful teacher. Allison was still on the 19th story. The desks were arranged in clusters of 4. Allison sat at a cluster with a girl named Virginia and a boy named Nick and a boy named Ray. But Virginia looked old enough to be her mother, and Nick looked like he should be in high school. Ray was a couple years younger than Allison. "Mrs. Jarvis is a wonderful teacher," said Virginia in a sing-song voice. "She's the nicest teacher I ever had." "She's the only teacher you ever had," said Nick. "So, she's still nice," said Virginia. I've always gotten all A's." "Aren't you a little old to be going to school?" Allison asked her. "You're never too old to learn," said Virginia. "No one ever leaves Mrs. Jarvis' class," said Nick. "How long have you been here, Virginia?" Virginia thought a moment. 32 wonderful years. "I've been here 9 years," said Nick. "But she always gives us good grades," said Virginia. "That's true," said Nick. "I've gotten all A's since I've been here too." "Me too," said Ray, "and sometimes I answer all the problems wrong on purpose." "Where were you before you came here?" Allison asked him. Ray shook his head. "That's funny, I don't remember." "I don't remember where I came from either," said Virginia. "Well, I do," said Allison. "I was in..." But suddenly she couldn't remember either. Then it came to her. Mrs. Jules' class, and Rondi was in class, and Jason and Dana and Todd. She named every member of the class, including all 3 Erics. She didn't want to forget where she came from. "If I forget where I came from, I might not never get back," she thought. "Did you say there was a girl named B.B. Gunn?" asked Ray. "Yes," said Allison. "B.B. is a very good artist." "My last name is Gunn too," said Ray. "I wonder if we're related." "Ray, no talking please," said Mrs. Jarvis. "Now everyone take out a pencil and some paper. I want you to write all the numbers from 0 to 1,000,000 in alphabetical order." "From 0 to 1,000,000? asked Allison. She couldn't believe it. "Don't worry," said Virginia. "If you run out of paper, Mrs. Jarvis has more in her closet." Allison stared at her in horror. "But it will take over 100 years," she said. "So," asked Virginia, "what's your hurry?" Allison started to work. It was bad enough having to write down all the numbers from 0 to 1,000,000, but she couldn't imagine how she would ever put them in alphabetical order 1 came before 2, 3 came after 1 but before 2, 4 came before 1, 5 came before 4, 6 came after 1 but before 3. Don't worry, said Virginia. If you ever miss a few, Mrs. Jarvis will always give you an A when you're finished. 7 came after 1 but before 6. 8 came first. Allison couldn't think of any number that would come before 8, so she wrote it down. She also knew that 0 would come last if she ever got that far, but she would be older than Virginia when she did. I'll talk to Lewis at recess, she thought. He'll save me. When's recess? She asked. There is no recess, said Ray. We're not allowed out of the classroom. What if you have to go to the bathroom? What's a bathroom? Asked Virginia. We don't eat either, said Nick. We just work all the time. But we never have homework, Virginia said cheerfully. That's because we never go home, said Nick. We get 2-minute breaks every 11 hours. But don't worry, said Virginia. Mrs. Jarvis always gives us good grades. Mrs. Jarvis walked around the room checking everybody's work. Excellent, Ray, she said. Very good, Virginia. You're doing wonderfully, Allison. You get an A for the day. Big deal, thought Allison. She had to figure out some way out of there. It was clear that Virginia, Nick, and Ray were too far gone to help her. Are there any new kids in the class? She asked. Ben's new, said Nick, and he pointed Ben out to her. Ben appeared to be about Allison's age. She was glad about that. When the 2-minute break came, she went over and talked to him. Are you Ben? She asked. No, he said. Oh, said Allison, I was looking for Ben. That's me, said the boy. But you just said... My name is Mark Miller, said the boy, but for some reason everybody calls me Benjamin Nushmut. There's a Mark Miller in my class, exclaimed Allison. I know, that's me, said Mark. I'm Mark Miller. No, I mean my other class, said Allison. What other class? Allison thought a moment. I don't remember, she said. After putting numbers in alphabetical order for 11 hours, her brain had turned to spaghetti. Time's up, said Mrs. Jarvis. Everyone, back to work. Chapter 19, again. Forever is never. Allison was stuck on the 19th story. 14 2-minute breaks had passed. It's dictionary time, said Mrs. Jarvis. Everybody got out a dictionary. Allison found a dictionary in her desk, too. What are we supposed to do with it? She asked. Memorize it, said Nick. But that's impossible, said Allison. No, it's easy, Virginia assured her. You memorize one word at a time until you get to a whole page. Then you go to the next page. How many words have you memorized? Asked Allison. I'm almost finished with B, Virginia said proudly, and I've only been doing it for 32 years. Allison opened her dictionary. Mrs. Jewell's class, she suddenly remembered, and she sighed with relief. For the last 6 days she had been trying to remember where she came from. In her mind, she went through everybody in her former class. She didn't want to forget again. As she thought about each person, tears filled her eyes. She missed them very much, even Jason. They were so wonderful in their own special ways. When the 2-minute break came, she talked to Mark. He was the only person in the class who seemed to have a brain. How did we get here? She asked. Maybe we're dead, said Mark. No, we're not dead. This is not heaven. What happens if we didn't do our work? Asked Allison. We have to do our work, said Mark. Why? Asked Allison. What's Mrs. Jarvis going to do to us? Keep us after school? I don't know, said Mark. Teachers can always find new ways to punish you. They're experts at it. Your 2 minutes are up, boys and girls, announced Mrs. Jarvis. Everyone back to work. Allison returned to her seat. She tried to figure it all out. But she had had so much busy work to do, she didn't have time to think. That's her plan, Allison suddenly realized. She shivered as it all came together for her. Mrs. Jarvis assigns us a lot of busy work so we don't have time to think. She makes us memorize dumb things so we don't have time to think about important things. And then she gives us good grades to keep us happy. Mrs. Jarvis walked around the room. Very good, Virginia, she said. You're doing so well. Excellent, Ray. Good job, Nick. She stopped when she got to Allison. Allison, why aren't you working? Allison looked at her. She knew Mark was right. Teachers are experts at finding ways to punish you. And if Mrs. Jarvis was really mean, you never knew what she would have up her sleeve. Still, Allison had to take a chance. If she wanted to get back to Mrs. Jewell's class, she had to act as if she was in Mrs. Jewell's class. She took off her shoes and socks and sat on the floor and sucked her toes. Allison, what are you doing? Asked Mrs. Jarvis. Allison took her toe out of her mouth. Get off my case, buzzard face, she said. Mrs. Jarvis was furious. Return to your desk, young lady, she ordered. Allison returned to her desk, but instead of sitting at it, she climbed on top of it and sang a song. I got one sock looking for the other, one sock looking for its brother. When I find that sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot and I'll stick it in my shoe. Mark Miller smiled at her and silently clapped his hands. Everyone else looked at her like she was crazy. Your socks are on the floor next to your shoes, Mrs. Jarvis said coldly. I'll give you 10 seconds to put them on your feet. 10, 9, 8, 7. Allison climbed down from her desk. She picked up her socks and put them on her ears. How's this? She asked. 6, 5, 4. Albert Einstein didn't wear socks, said Allison. Why should I? 3, 2. Allison closed her eyes. 1. She felt something slam down on her foot. Something else jammed into her stomach. Oomph! She grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Are you all right? Asked Dee Dee. Huh? Said Allison. She was on the stairs somewhere between the 18th and 20th story. Sorry, said Ron. I didn't see you. Dee Dee and I were racing up the stairs and then suddenly you appeared. You knocked off her shoes and socks, exclaimed Dee Dee. Oh, and I ripped your jacket too, said Ron. I'm sorry. That's okay, said Allison, and she picked up her shoes and socks. Race you up the stairs. All 3 ran up to Mrs. Jewell's room. When they got there, they were so pooped they sat with their tongues hanging out and their heads on their desks. Hi, Allison, said Rhondy. Allison raised her head. Hi, Rhondy, she said happily. What did I miss while I was absent? When were you absent? Asked Rhondy. Hey, how come you're not wearing your shoes and socks? Allison hung her socks from her ears. What do you think? She asked. It's the new look. Rhondy laughed. Allison, said Mrs. Jules, you seem to have a bad case of the sillies this morning. Allison giggled. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. Look what I brought, he said. What's the name of your goldfish? Asked Mrs. Jules. Shark, said Jason, and everyone laughed. It makes him feel important, Jason exclaimed. Where should I put him? How about on top of the coat closet, suggested Mrs. Jules. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Allison turned around to watch. She didn't want to miss what was fixing to happen next. Okay, so we finally got off chapter 19. That was just a funny little adventure of what we got to see about Wayside School, about not having a 19th story, and so then we got to have a 19th chapter that lasted a few chapters long. So we kind of got to see what was going on in Mrs. Jarvis' class. So I hope you're enjoying our read aloud. We're getting very close to finishing. We'll be finishing this week. Love you guys. Have a nice night. Bye.